Morning everybody. So I've marked all of your progress exams and trying to get them back to you. I've scanned them all in and emailed them to you, so you should be able to have your own paper there. Just find it by looking at your surname. They're all in a PDF. If you have that in front of you when I go through this, then it'll kind of be like we're in class and I'm trying to go through as much of it as I can. So that's you guys on the board. Okay, I've just made you into your initials in case anyone else could try and find out who you are, etc. Looking at Progress Exam 2, fantastic set of results. For people who are way above where their grade boundaries are, so it really was quite phenomenal. In terms of breaking it down into the three different sections, social influence, the mean is 11.9, memory 14.2, psychopathology 15.2. Now remember, that doesn't make sure or make you think that everybody got that. That's not what a mean shows you. Okay, you need to dig into a mean a little bit more, but on balance you would see that people actually got better as the paper went on, so much better in psychopathology, maybe not so much in social influence. So I'm going to go through it question by question. If you have your paper in front of you, and then if it's possible, try and put something in the comments underneath this video, and I'll try and answer them as much as I can. Okay, so the first question was, name 3 behaviours that enable a minority to influence a majority. Nice and simple: consistency, commitment, flexibility. You didn't have to explain what all those were, that's what you do in the second question. Okay, so the next question then says, Marcus wants to persuade his group of friends to go travelling. Briefly suggest how Marcus might use those 3 behaviours. So, for instance, consistency. He might keep repeating the same message and saying to his friends all the time that they want to go. What does he want to do? He wants to go travelling. So he'd tell them all that he wants to go travelling. Showing commitment, that's the kind of, if everyone has a go at you, you keep on doing it. So how might Marcus show it? Carry on planning the trip even though everybody else is saying, no, I don't want to do that. And then finally, the flexibility element is if he wants to go travelling, they want to go to the beach, he says, let's do a little bit of travelling to a beach or something along those lines. Okay? But mostly answered pretty well. I think the vast majority of us got all of those marks, that's fine. On to the next question. Outline Ash's findings in relation to 2 variables of conformity, and then briefly explain 2 limitations. So this is an 8-mark question, but it's split really into 4 2-mark questions. So outline a finding in relation to a variable. Okay, so for instance, you could have said about how group size, that was one of the variables, affected conformity. So when it's 1 against 1, no one conformed. 2 against 1, it goes to about 10-12% conformity. 3 against 1, it goes up to about 33% conformity. Okay, don't make the mistake of saying that as the amount of people increase, conformity also increases. So you could have had group size, you could have had task difficulty. So you could have either said it made it harder by putting all the lines the same length, or maybe making it easier because of the engineers. So engineers should, in theory, even if all the lines look very similar, they're quite confident, so it should be easy for the engineers. The other one was unanimity. Now you need to remember that unanimity is what he had in the original study. Think of that word, unanimous. So what happens when you break unanimity and you have a social supporter? And when you have a social supporter, conformity drops, and a lot of people did that. And 1 or 2 people said about anonymity as well. That's where you were allowed to write it down anonymously, and that led to about 12% conformity. Interestingly, if you are going to talk about anonymity, it goes against the idea of normative social influence, because normative social influence says that you do it to fit in and not be ridiculed, but if they're writing theirs down, they can't be ridiculed. So maybe it was more informational social influence with anonymity. And then I said it was an 8-mark question, broke down into 4 bits. So you then had to do 2 limitations. You could have said something like, Ash's findings might not be relevant, might not have temporal validity, it was done in the 1950s, totally different group of people. The task was artificial, so therefore lacked any real validity, can't really be applied anywhere else. Could have said about it being gender biased because it only used males, volunteer sample, and so on. Remember, you've got the mark scheme. I've also put that onto show my homework today, so you'll be able to go through this as well. Okay, the next one, answered pretty well. What's psychological research shown about short-term memory according to the multi-store model of memory? Really what you should have said here is capacity, duration and encoding. So capacity of short-term memory, that's Miller's magic number 7, so plus or minus 2, so effectively between 5 and 9 bits of information. Duration is between 18 and 30 seconds, and it's mostly coded acoustically or something based on sound. You could have also, if you're trying to get the full 4 marks there, you could have said something like capacity to be increased by chunking, etc. And then question 6, this was answered pretty well by most people, so I won't dwell on it too much, but you've got the stem there about Annie still being able to skateboard. She hasn't done it for ages. Jermaine knows his first day at school, and Billy knows the name of tools. So you have to identify what type of long-term memory was there and then say why. So some of you did drop some marks because you just said the likes of Annie is a case of procedural memory, but you didn't say that's because she can remember how to do an action. Jermaine was episodic memory, and Billy, remembering the names of things, was semantic memory. Okay, below are 5 statements about the cognitive interview. Now, in terms of these statements, you have to forgive me because I don't have them in the mark scheme. So, 5 statements about the cognitive interview, which 2 statements are correct. Quite a few people drop marks on this, so I'm going to explain to you. Can be used in Western cultures. So which of these ones are correct? Can only be used in Western cultures. So it can't only be used in Western culture, it can be used all over the place. So that's obviously false. It does take longer than a standard interview, so B was correct. Involves an ethical treatment of the witness? No, it's not like, you're frisking or any of that kind of stuff. Requires special training of police officers? It does, okay? Not everybody can just go ahead and do a cognitive interview. It's different to the standard police interview, so that's why D was correct. And then cannot be used to interview children? It can be, okay? The enhanced version of that can be used to interview children. Okay, and then this next question you probably did find a little bit tricky. What has psychological research shown about the working memory? It says in your answer refer to theory and or evidence, and it's a little bit of a strangely worded question, this one, I guess. I think some people saw psychological research and thought, right, I have to just talk about whatever pieces of research I can remember, and you could have actually just explained the whole theory behind the working memory model, for instance. So the other thing is, well, you've got a model, you could have drawn it, so draw all the different parts of it. So the first part of it, when you're trying to do your next steps now, just draw the image. Remember, I kind of present a different image to you sometimes with the working memory model, but you can draw whichever one you want. You just need to make sure that the episodic buffer is kind of something that's an add-on, okay? And then some models break the phonological store down into further subdivided, so primary acoustic store and articulatory loop, but not all of them do. I like to do that because it makes it a bit easier when you're trying to explain it. So the first part of that then is trying to give that theory, just to explain all the different things about the central executive and so on. In terms of the discussion points that you could have talked about, you could have talked about how it's potentially better than the multi-store model of memory because it gives a more expanded view of short-term memory. You certainly could have used evidence to try and support the existence of the model. So some of the better answers you did, you talked about Paul Essu and doing the PET scans, and you talked about Robbins with the chess players. I think the error that some people made is they kind of just launched straight into an essay which tells you all about the Robbins study, which you did pick up marks for, but you do also need to discuss the working memory model as well. You could have also talked about the tasks being artificial, okay? How many people sit there have to recreate chessboards while saying the word "the" over and over again? So, yeah, maybe lacking validity again. It's an artificial task, and so on. You could have also brought in that idea that Badley and Hitch, who've created the working memory model, have this central point, which is the central executive, and yet they actually kind of admit they don't really know much about it or how it works and so on. So there's loads of different things that you could have talked about there. It does say ethical issues aren't really relevant because they don't influence the understanding of how the memory model works, even though some of them might have been unethical. Okay, and then on to the last section, which it appears that you did much better on than the other sections. Okay, so I really did quite like marking this one. I marked it very quickly because the answer for your 4 definitions is CBA, and by the time you get into the second half of marking everybody's, that's kind of what it feels like sometimes. Okay, I think absolutely everybody got that right, so I don't need to go through that one with you. The next one, describe at least one strategy that might be used in cognitive behaviour therapy. Well, when you were in class, I asked you to design a leaflet to explain what cognitive behaviour therapy was. So that's kind of what you should have been drawing on for that. But a strategy that you use for CBT is getting them, or challenging their irrational thoughts, getting them to think whether or not the way that they are thinking is entirely rational. So if they think that everybody hates them, for instance, you challenge that and you say, well, what do you mean by everybody? Can you go out this week and try and find 2 people who are going to talk to you, or, you know. So things like that. So it's about reality testing whether or not their ideas were correct. And if it says something like describe at least one strategy, well, a strategy might be keeping a diary. So keeping a diary of everybody that you come into contact with that week, write down how it made you feel, write down what they said, and then the other strategy then is when you're back with the therapist, as you talk about what happened, and they will then try and change your irrational beliefs. So if you thought everybody hates you, and you go back into a session, then you find out that 20 people this week talked to me and not one of them was negative, you're trying to get them to change that, okay? So you really need to focus there on how does it work, what does CBT look like? So that's where some people did drop some marks. And then 4 evaluative statements about CBT, which one is correct? The answer was B. It gives the client some control over the therapy, but again, I think most people got that correct. Okay, the next one. Sarah's got a fear of cats. Her fear stops her from going anywhere that she thinks she might see a cat. Explain how Sarah's phobia could be treated using systematic desensitisation. Now, you need to explain the steps of systematic desensitisation here. So, as a bit of a side note, I definitely remember some people start to evaluate it. The question doesn't ask you to do that at all, so don't waste your time doing something you're not asked to do. But you do just need to talk your way through those steps. Remember, with systematic desensitisation, I've told you the thing most people forget is they say about relaxing, or they fail to say about relaxing, sorry. So, Sarah needs to be taught to relax. First of all, you need to find a strategy. If that's listening to music, if it's breathing, it can literally be anything. But find Sarah's strategy, and then you increase the intensity of whatever she's afraid of. So in this instance, it's cats, and you do it with that hierarchy, okay, that kind of step-by-step approach. So you should have said words like gradual exposure, hierarchy, or single stage, okay? You could have said about the notion of why it works, okay, so the fact that you can't be anxious and relaxed at the same time, so the principle doesn't make sense. So if you can be relaxed, that's what helps. And then some of the better answers, you gave me examples of what that hierarchy looks like. So you may have said about start off with a picture of a cartoon cat, or even just the word cat, and then see a picture of a cat, and then maybe touch a teddy cat until you have a cat in that room, okay, but explaining that stimulus hierarchy. Okay, and then on to the final question. Bit of a tricky question. So outline and evaluate neural and genetic explanations for OCD. But again, this was answered pretty well by a lot of people. Okay, so you've got to grips with this. Neural explanations are referring to anything which is occurring within the brain. Remember that word neuro, okay? Neural brain. And then genetic explanations. Now, we need to be careful here with the genetic explanations and the neural explanations. So, a genetic explanation is assuming that you've inherited the genes from your bloodline, from your family, and that's what's causing the OCD. And that's what the theory says. But what they do is they say that you inherit a gene like the COMP gene or the SERT gene. Okay? And the genetic explanation is that you've inherited the COMP gene and the SERT gene, and it's having that gene which makes you more vulnerable or more likely to have caught the disorder or developed the disorder. Where it gets a little bit confusing is because people who have the COMP gene tend to have higher amounts of dopamine, and people who have the SERT gene tend to have lower amounts of serotonin. And that has also been implicated in causing OCD. So you need to explain the genetic explanation, say you've inherited the COMP gene, you've inherited the SERT gene. If you then go into neural explanations and talk about neurotransmitters, that's where you'd be talking then about dopamine and about serotonin. So the neural explanation then is that you've got too much dopamine, that could be the cause, and the other one is that you've got too low levels of serotonin. when you're trying to evaluate those explanations, you then also might say, how about high amounts of people in the family have all been found to have this COMP gene or the CERT gene, where you've got those instances where 6 people in one family all have OCD and they all seem to have this similar gene. You could have also talked about how it could be a neurotransmitter explanation or a chemical explanation based on drugs that you give people. When you give drugs that increase the amount of serotonin or reduce the amount of dopamine in typical people, you sometimes see the symptoms of OCD. But obviously just remember that's not necessarily the case, because take the paracetamol and a headache idea, a lack of paracetamol isn't the reason for a headache. Okay, so you can't always make that assumption. So we did pretty well with that, the COMP gene and the CERT gene. And obviously it says to refer to the conversation above, and you were pretty good, I think, really in your application of those. Let's see what I've got here. So Melanie, it wasn't a surprise to me that David had OCD because his mum is always tidying things, putting them in order and checking switches. Emma says, really, I didn't know that. I always thought that people with OCD have something in their brains that makes them behave that way. So the first one is definitely talking about a genetic explanation, because it's saying mum has got it. The second one, you could have talked about the brain pathways, the circuit pathways. So you've got your orbital frontal cortex at the front of the brain, you've got your basal ganglia at the back, and you have that kind of constant feedback loop. Everybody gets irrational thoughts. It's just most people are able to kind of just blank them away and say, well, that was a strange thing to have thought of. People with OCD get an irrational thought, such as, touch that tree or my mum's going to die, and then they don't get that feedback which says to them, that's not real, that's not going to happen. And so they feel compelled then to go and touch that tree. And the studies have shown that when you do fMRIs to people with OCD who have these worry circuits, they don't get that accurate feedback that dismisses the irrational thought, which is why they act upon it. Okay, so that was the other one that you could have gone on and explained as one of the explanations. In terms of evaluation, we've said things like, the drug idea, so the chemical imbalance might not necessarily be the reason. You could have also talked about the fact that there's a time delay with drugs. Now, if a chemical imbalance is supposed to be the reason for OCD, and you give them a drug and that within a few hours it balances them, why does it take 5 or 6 weeks to work? Could that potentially be a placebo effect or something instead? Sessions, family studies could be explained. Yes, so shared environments, again, the other one that a lot of you probably would have picked up on is, you're trying to say it's a genetic explanation, but in reality it could be more of an environmental explanation. So the example I gave you before of the 6 people in the one family all with OCD could very well be because they're all living together, they're all being brought up in the same idea, and so on. So that's a very quick, I think it was quick, I don't know how long it went on for, but a little bit of feedback from your progress exam. Go back and do your next steps now. I know an awful lot of you are either at your target grade or past your target grade, but there's still room for improvement in all of them. Each of those sections was out of 24. Okay, so there is still a little bit more to do. Use the mark scheme, use some of the guidance I've written on it, and bring it up to speed. Ask me any questions in the comments of this video, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, enjoy your independent learning. I'll get back to you whenever I can.